Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for listening. I'm JD. Let's talk about the digital humanities. So, digital humanities, what it is, and if you should care. So, let's start with the first question. What is it? So, I'm going to be using a number of definitions from Joanna Drucker and her 2014 book, The Digital Humanities. And I think this one wraps it up well, even if it's a sort of untraditional definition. Digital humanities is born of the encounter between traditional humanities and computational methods. So, really, this relationship, traditional ways in which we've conducted research, and how these new digital tools have allowed us new capabilities and what exists in the space in between. And that's really what I'll be exploring today, is some of the new things that have evolved in that space. So as far as the history, how has this term come about? So you see kind of developing in the early 80s, or rather late 80s, and taking off more towards the late 90s, early 2000s. This Graham ends at 2008, but the term has continued to rise in popularity over the past years. And this really coordinates with the rise of different technologies that make the digital humanities possible. So I'm going to use Nancy Ross's here, I guess zooming in here, sure, why not? Um, 5 phases that she defines digital humanities having gone through. So the digitization of humanities texts, making sense of big data, visualization, reshaping, and open source research. So yeah, let's start with the first, digitization of humanities texts. And here, I think really highlighting the ability, the availability, and searchability. So to use a Drucker quote here, we have so much text available, and it's really the ways in which we can query and comprehend that cultural record. So how can we contain all that data? How can we pull it together? And we see that onslaught, right? I think the one here that says it best, 1.3 exabytes of data. So this enormous, enormous bank of data. We know this. How do we make sense of it? And how do we continue to grow it? And some of these technologies, these are a little bit more modern, but things like book scanners that have allowed us to digitize the millions and billions of books out there in unprecedentedly fast ways. In addition, things like OCR, which have allowed that text to be read easily and digitized. So how we can take all of the history of human knowledge up to this point and turn it into hypertext, turn it into computer code. Now, with that in mind, markup is a big part of this. So as we're talking about the relationship between both human researcher and the digital research tool, a lot of that is translation and learning for the human researcher to write in this sort of way, to code and make sure we put text in a way that's easy for it to organize. So using things like tagging to make sure that these texts are easy to be contained within these databases. Now, this just doesn't happen to digital text as well. This is happening in other forms of the humanities, including the art world, where classic works are being analyzed, doing color analysis to see, what colors existed in what region. Art histories pick this up a lot. How an artist may have evolved over time, as we see with Van Gogh up on top, and all these new ways to kind of look at these texts that get away from just a traditional look and kind of repeat what you think about it. So definitely a very large shift within a tradition that's likely had these same methodology for so many years. So the next step is really the crucial one. We have all these tools to digitize these texts. So how do we make sense of that? And really it's about putting them together in relation. So a number of these tools, some of which you may have used, and just to use another Drucker quote, so the dialogue with the outliers, the anomalies, and how all of this data can provide valuable contributions. So moving on there, some other tools, Zotero being one I think many of you may have used, enabling you to compile different articles, compile different sorts of pictures, models, all sorts of different texts, references into one research tool. So a good organizational tool. One of the ones that I've used a lot as well is a program called AntConc. I used it for my thesis. It allows you to essentially take over all of these texts that I've loaded in here, and I can scan for certain words. So I could say I want to see the instances of something like, let's say, good here. So I can say, all right, here's the number of instances good has appeared in my corpus, and from there I can also look, error there. So the different lines in terms of how that term developed, and all these different digital tools to look at this in a way that I traditionally could not, or probably would not, had I just read the text. So the idea being a computer can absolutely give a very quantitative reading, a very different macro reading of the text, and then the human can then bring it in. And this is distance and close reading techniques. And I'll talk about this a little bit more as we go into digital visualization. But what can a computer add? Well, it can analyze text in this big data way that a human can't. And then a human researcher can come in here and really give context to all that textual data. So let's get into visualization here, and I think legibility, the key. So to use another quote, it's the way in which we complement, enhance, and or sometimes intention with the textual. So again, here framing data visualization not as a better means than, say, writing a paper or text, but as a different means that has its own advantages and disadvantages to being able to interpret and present data. So one of the leaders in this field is Franco Moretti, who really established the distance reading term. This is one of his early projects, the Horatio project, so looking through the text of Hamlet and noting where there were different connections between characters and drawing a network map based on the play. So a way to visualize the different relationality of characters within something like Hamlet. So taking a very literary text and giving it this kind of networked view to it. And he's got a lot of great work on this. Other one I really like is this one, Modernists Wrote the City. So Alex Christie taking about 100 different texts which presented fictional accounts of the city of Paris and noting where those texts used, what locations were used in there, and plotting which locations had more prevalence within those. So we see those locations, something like around the Champs-Élysées having a lot more play than, say, maybe somewhere on the outskirts. So how modernists kind of represent disproportionately parts of the city. So maybe how our perception of Paris could have changed based on these representations. Another very cool example of this, one of my favorite articles from Kieran Healy. And what he did is he was looking at Paul Revere. So why was Paul Revere in American history such an important character? And he here goes and looks at different New England, I can't really call them clubs, but I guess these sort of rebel organizations within Boston in the late 1700s. So we have the five, and notes who were the members of each of those organizations. So just giving basic binary, 01, were they, weren't they members, and saying, okay, who were members of multiple groups? Okay, so we see certain men maybe a little bit more involved than others. And how do those different groups relate to each other? So where's the overlap between them? How many members, co-members? So for instance, London Enemies in North Caucasus has a lot of overlapping members. So within that, we can then draw an even bigger map and understand, okay, so who was a member of many of these organizations, and how did maybe some of them rise as more important in terms of their connection with all of these organizations. And here it's where Healy finds Paul Revere right at the center in this plot. So we see how important of a figure he is just by nature of mapping this in a very clever way. So going in next, and these are the last two stages, I think the most experimental as far as digitization and the digital humanities go. So starting here with the presentation, reshaping academia, and thinking about how these new multiple approaches have allowed us to go beyond, say, the 25-page research paper and have very different ways to present and execute research, and what are the ways that are being taken advantage of. There's some good historical examples of this. Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, an incredible work talking about visualization and the eye as it relates to illustrations done back in 1993. And a little bit more recently, the Duke Rotary Center doing this project Virtual Peace, which used Second Life to allow students to act as emergency responders to a disaster and to have a live role-playing exercise there to try to figure out how they would handle this situation through a simulator. So kind of a novel way to try to engage different students in this sort of project, and the hashtag being a very big organization involved in that. Another interesting example is Adrienne Coe, her experiment in crowdsourcing. So looking at putting academic articles, doing this like Reddit style. So can we get academic articles, which typically sit kind of dead on the page in many journals, can we do something like upvoting to really try to get a social aspect to rises to the top? Now, some of this is kind of already what happens with referencing in terms of Google Scholar, But I think what she's going for in this particular article is to have more comments, have more dialogue surrounding the article when they're published, not just to wait until something becomes a classic and kind of rises to the top. So this crowdsourcing idea. So finally, open source academia. So looking at not just scholars, like how can they present their new work, but how can we invite more voices and different voices than traditionally seen into research, into scholarship. And a big part of this is, I think we can see anything here that's important, public sphere. We'll come back to all this. So I want to do a few projects that I think really take advantage of crowdsourcing, this being kind of the big move lately. So the California Historical Society doing this project, Curating by the Bay, they asked people all over the Bay Area to send in pictures that they had of the Bay, their families, friends, whoever, and they collected all this data and were able to put a historical map together that showed the environmental change of that region just through all of the different texts that people had sent in. So a very cool project that allowed a lot of people's work to come together to create something bigger. And one of my favorite projects here that I want to show, and kind of one of the papers that inspired me to kind of look more into the digital humanities, by Nancy Ross. I am more on the pedagogy side. That's my interest as a researcher, and I think that this is just an incredible paper that does this. So she asked students in her art history class, she wanted them to get them to engage in gender representation, to talk about female artists and maybe why they aren't represented in as many texts. And what she found was students not just saying they're left out, but the number of that women were only talked about in relation to other male artists, right? So in this case, creating a map in terms of who was related to whom within female artists. So can you create a history, an art history based around just female artists? And that's exactly what her students did, eventually creating this digital map. They created kind of an alternate network of artists based only around female-based artists. And what I thought was the coolest thing about her paper were her findings at the end to say that her students felt that there were openings in scholarship. They realized that it was incomplete, that even they at an undergraduate level could contribute and fill a lot of the gaps in research and scholarship. And I think that empowering sense is what makes this really such an incredible tool, that students can feel like they have a place in this research by using these tools that are fairly easy to use and allow for a huge dissemination of data so quickly. Okay, so obviously some critiques here. First, does any of this stuff actually contribute knowledge? And I think an overall answer is not really. Not a lot of answers have come from just digital research methods. What I would argue here, and what Drucker and a number of other scholars argue, is that there is a lot that the digital humanities tools offer so many new questions, new ways to look at problems. And I think it's, again, in that balance between the human researcher, what role can they play, and the digital research assistant. And I think that that tension between the two can create some really amazing scholarship. So whether it solves anything or not isn't so much the question, it's what sorts of new questions can we ask using these tools. Next, misdirecting our inquiry. So how are we fitting the content to fit the form, kind of forcing ourselves to use these digital tools in a way that may not be natural. And essentially here, it's an attempt not to say, oh, I'm going to go out of my way to use a digital tool, and to not think of the digital humanities as a separate thing altogether. It is within the humanities. It's just a new way, new methodological ways to approach the humanities. So I think using it kind of as a supplement rather than a thing on its own is the key to getting around there. I think the biggest critique here, though, is authenticity and authorship, right? So if we're all collaborative, if anyone can be a researcher, well, what does that do to tenure track jobs? What does that do for dissertations where you need to show your work? You need to show your own scholarship. And I think here this is where these questions, they need to be ironed out. A lot of these tools are just entering academia, and I think there's a sense of need to figure out how we're going to use these and readjust kind of the academic system as it exists to allow these tools and allow these methods to be a little bit more normalized. So just to conclude here with our final question, should we care? Well, I definitely think we should. I think these tools are going to be as naturalized within research as the word processor was 20 years ago, and that it's necessary for different grad students at these levels, even undergrads, to really become more adept at using these different tools. And just to finish with this quote, very utopian feel, but Drucker here, and looking to establish a future in which participation is possible by everyone, anywhere, anytime, and really this Habermasian sweep at the end with a public sphere in which no one is excluded. Obviously very utopian, but I think if we look at the digital humanities not as exclusionary tools, which sort of reward coders and leave people who just want to read books out of the blue, but as a supplement, a new way to look at what could be old problems, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to use them in the past. Thank you very much. See you later, everybody.